Lecture 14, Sickness Within and Without. During the late medieval times, roughly from the 1300s through the 1400s, several elements within the church and outside of the church can be considered as illnesses, or you could say darknesses. One example, which was entirely an illness in the literal sense, was the Black Plague that took millions of human lives, including some of the best clergy and religious because they were the most generous. Other examples that are less evident as illnesses are the Avignon Papacy, the Papal Schism, and the 100 Years' War. The Black Plague. The Black Plague, which began around 1346, was responsible for millions of deaths. According to John Kelly in The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, and I quote, "Today, a demographic disaster on the scale of the Black Plague would claim 1.9 billion lives." In the Middle East, the plague claimed a third of the population. China lost 50% of its population due to the plague and wars. Various regions of Europe lost between 40 to 60% of its population to the plague. The carrier of the plague virus were fleas carried by rats. Poor sanitary conditions were a major factor in the spread of the Black Plague, since they provided an ideal environment for rats to multiply. In describing the unsanitary conditions of medieval times, Kelly writes the following, I quote, "A combination of people, rats, flies, waste, and garbage concentrated inside a few square miles of town walls made the medieval city a human cesspool. By the early 14th century, so much filth had collected inside urban Europe that French and Italian cities were naming streets after human waste. Other Parisian streets took their names from the animals slaughtered on them. One irate Londoner complained that the runoff from the local slaughterhouse had made his garden stinking and putrid, while another charged that the blood from slain animals flooded nearby streets and lanes, making a foul corruption an abominable sight to all dwelling near. The medieval countryside, where 90% of the population lived, was an even more dangerous place than the medieval city. Thinly walled peasant homes were highly permeable, and the rat-to-person ratio tended to be very high in rural areas. Urban rat colonies usually divided their attention among several homes on a street. But in the country, not uncommonly, a single peasant family would find itself the target of an entire rodent colony." End of quote. Another major factor that contributed to the high rate of death during the time of the plague include a series of harsh winters and torrential rain in the early 1300s. The adverse weather conditions caused severe food shortages, an increase in food prices, and famines. One significant famine took place shortly before the first signs of plague symptoms were recorded. This meant, before the plague began and rapidly spread, many people had compromised immune systems, making them more susceptible to disease, above all to the Black Plague. At the time of the plague, doctors did not have our knowledge of how viruses spread, as the germ theory of the French chemist Louis Pasteur well explains. One prominent explanation for the occurrence of the plague was proposed by the Paris Medical Faculty in 1348. According to their report, the plague was caused by the formation of 3 planets that caused pollution in the air which contained the plague. A Franciscan friar from Frannonia, Hermann Gigas, in his 1349 chronicle records, and I quote, "Some say that the Black Plague was brought about by the corruption of the air." Immediately after this, he adds the following: "Others, that the Jews planned to wipe out all the Christians with poison and had poisoned the wells and springs everywhere. In accordance with this false belief, many Jewish people were scapegoated and killed." According to one report, also from 1349, I quote, "All the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burned." This terrible action occurred despite Cologne's civic officials insisting that the Jewish people were innocent. Similarly, The Duke of Austria's efforts to protect the Jewish people from being scapegoated were repeatedly ignored. Avignon Papacy. To what extent the Avignon Papacy was a manifestation of internal sickness within the Church is subject to debate. At Avignon, 7 successive popes ruled from 1309 to 1376. Some scholars hold that far from being detrimental to the Church, the papal court at Avignon, France, was a necessity and in some ways helpful to the Church. As Michael Jones in the New Cambridge Medieval History states, I quote, "In the 13th century and earlier, Rome was a dangerous place because of the riots and tumults there in which the Roman aristocracy took a leading part." End of quote. Beside the violent nature of Rome, another beneficial factor in the papacy residing in Avignon, argues Jones, was that, and I quote again, was more conveniently situated than central Italy for most countries with which the papacy was in frequent contact. End of quote. In this supposedly ideal location, the second Avignon Pope, John the 22nd, reformed church administration by centralizing power and finances. When he died, he left the Avignon papacy in a sound financial shape. His financial reforms were further adopted and developed by his successors. Despite some of the positive features of the Avignon papacy, St. Catherine of Siena, of the Third Order Dominicans, she lived in the 1300s, was convinced that the Pope needed to return to Rome. Rome is the site where the apostles Peter and Paul bore witness to Christ by their martyrdoms. It is fitting, therefore, but not absolutely necessary, that popes reside in Rome where Peter and Paul manifested heroic leadership. In accordance with this belief, St. Catherine of Siena begged in a letter to the 7th and last Avignon Pope, Gregory XI, that he return to Rome. And I'm just going to read a little excerpt of Caterina in her letter to the Pope. "I, Caterina, servant and slave of the servants of Jesus Christ, and your poor, wretched, unworthy daughter, am writing to you in his precious blood. Vice and sin, the pride and filth that are rampant among Christian people, especially among the prelates, pastors, and administrators of Holy Church, who have turned to eating and devouring souls, not converting them, but devouring them. And it all comes from their selfish love for themselves, from which pride is born, and greed and avarice and spiritual and bodily impurity. They see the infernal wolves carrying off their charges, and it seems they don't care. Their care has been absorbed in piling up worldly pleasures and enjoyment, approval and praise. And all this comes from their selfish love for themselves. For if they love themselves for God instead of selfishly, they would be concerned only about God's honor and not their own, for their neighbor's good and not their own self-indulgence. Ah, my dear Babbo, see that you attend to these things. Look for good, virtuous men and put them in charge of the little sheep. So come, delay no longer, so you may soon set up camp against the unbelievers. And so you will not be frustrated in the endeavor by these rotten members who are rebelling against you. Peace, 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 my dear Babbo. No more war. Take courage, Father." In 1377, Pope Gregory IX granted St. Catherine Siena's request and returned to Rome. The next year he died. During the papal conclave that followed his death, a Roman mob gathered outside. They violently demanded the conclave elect a pope from Rome or at least from Italian lands. The mob chanted, and I quote, a Roman, or at least an Italian, or else we'll kill them all." Within this tense environment, the cardinals elected the Archbishop of Bari, Bartolomeo Prignano, who is neither from Rome nor from France, but originally from Naples. Prignano took the name Urban VI. The same year Urban VI became pope, the French cardinals, who had been used to a pope living in their lands, returned to France and went into schism by electing a French anti-pope, Clement VII, who ruled from Avignon. The Avignon papacy began when the French cardinals, out of dislike of Urban VI, elected the anti-pope Clement VII. The line of Pisan anti-popes occurred when an invalid church council was held in Pisa in 1409. participants of the Council of Pisa subscribed to the heresy of conciliarism. According to conciliarism, a church council has greater power than a pope. Following this heresy, the Council of Pisa invalidly deposed the valid Roman Pope Gregory XII and then elected the anti-pope Alexander V. When Alexander V died, another anti-pope of Pisa was elected, John XXIII. The schism was finally resolved during the Ecumenical Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418. At the council's request, the Roman Pope Gregory XII resigned. The anti-pope Benedict XIII of Avignon was excommunicated, and the Pisan anti-pope John XXIII resigned. Once this occurred, the Council of Constance then elected Martin V. The papal schism exacerbated tensions between countries that already were in conflict with one another, especially between France and England. And I provide a map in your transcript that indicates which countries, prior to the Pisan anti-pope, supported the Avignon anti-pope and which supported the Roman pope. As is evident, England supported the Roman pope, while France and Castile supported the Avignon anti-pope. The confusion that resulted from these divisions greatly decreased the respect leaders and their people gave to the papacy. The 100 Years' War. At the same time the Avignon papacy and the papal schism were occurring, the so-called 100 Years' War between England and allies and France and allies was taking place. This war, lasted from 1337 to 1453, was made up by a series of successive small wars. In 1415, English forces, led by King Henry V, gained the upper hand and defeated the French at the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. Inspired by Saint Joan of Arc, French patriots regained control of their lands in 1453 at the Battle of Castillon. As the French were fighting to gain back their lands from the English, Saint Joan of Arc was captured by Burgundians and sold in 1430 to the English. She was tried as a heretic by an ecclesiastical court controlled by the English, which had her burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431. St. Joan of Arc was only 19 years old when she died. As she was burning, she called on the name of Jesus. God bless.